The musical genre has long been The musical genre has long been associated with the queer community. The stereotype dates back to the pre-Stonewall era, where the theatre represented a safe space for gay men to congregate and freely express their flamboyance. As queer theorist John Clum asserts, the media representation of gay men who love musicals has since then been reinforced by popular culture. Think about it. When the quintessential theatre kid Ryan Evans came out as gay in the High School Musical spin-off, the news did not really shock anyone. Why? Because he likes musicals?
Yes.
It's hard then to ignore the relationship, both historical and imagined, of the queer community with the genre. This affinity has long been studied in theatre and film scholarship, but still, generalization around a specific community is undeniably harmful. So I guess this calls for a quick disclaimer. This video is by no means condoning stereotypes, nor does it aim to perpetuate assumption about the gay community. Instead, it examines the genre's structure through a queer lens, attempting to reveal what makes it formally, aesthetically, and essentially queer. In everyday language, queer as a concept is often used as an identity marker. In queer studies, however, the framework of this video, the term is understood as all that is anti-normative, anti-binary, anti-capitalist, in other words, anything that dares disrupt the status quo. Musicals are not everybody's cup of tea. A lot of the hate directed towards it is caused almost exclusively by the fact that characters unnaturally burst into song and dance. Interestingly enough for Sarah Taylor Ellis, this rupture of realism is precisely the point from which the genre's inherent queerness emerges. Our mainstream understanding of time as linear and horizontal conveniently reinforces the normative institutions of the family, heterosexuality, and reproduction, and strictly controls our work-leisure balance. This goal-oriented conception of time, the grind and hustle culture, zooms rigidly forward, not allowing us to stop and smell the flowers. In Doing the Time Warp, Ellis posits queer temporality in opposition to heteronormative time. This queer temporal conception complicates the straightforward, progress-driven relationship to time, embracing instead the here and the now, veering away from the typical markers of life experience like birth, marriage, reproduction, and death. In a musical, we find the linearity of straight time in the plot, structured along a forward-moving linear timeline that gets characters going from story point A to story point B. Musical numbers interrupt this linearity, going off the delineated path and thus queering time. An almost too perfect example of this is every time Dorothy meets a new character on her way to the city of Oz, she's both literally and figuratively stalled on her path, and the yellow brick road is queered from a linear road to a stage for performance and theatrical expression. The fun thing about queer temporality is its ability to go beyond the screen. When you put on a musical, not only are you expecting these moments of difference of temporalities, but you are anticipating them with a desire to embrace and actively participate in the performance of difference. In fact, musicals invite you to do so. They want you to sing and dance along, and so as you're watching, you find yourself humming, bopping your head, snapping your fingers, and tapping your feet. Theater scholar Stacey Wolf suggests that our identifications with the musical rely less on narrative and character and more on bodies shaped through song and dance, the pleasures of the performance itself. By forging an affective link between the characters' bodies and the spectator's body, the musical allows us to examine this identification in terms of bodily empathy, thus breaking away from the binary traps of the male gaze and other gendered identification theories. When les deux sœurs jumelles nées sous le signe des Gémeaux break out in song in Les Demoiselles de Rochefort, what they're doing is introduce
Nous sommes deux sœurs jumelles nées sous le signe des
What they're doing is introduce themselves, except they do it over and over and over and over again.
Nous sommes deux sœurs jumelles, nous sommes deux sœurs jumelles, nous sommes deux sœurs jumelles nées sous le signe des Gémeaux.
Repeating the chorus at least 4 times. This repetition is an instance of queer temporality, where time is bent into a loop, going in circles instead of moving forward. And as we are effectively implicated by the singing and dancing, the musical invites us to enjoy and take part in the temporal queerness. Boy, girl, old and young are all able to identify with the ladies' performing bodies, and this gender-blind, visceral, embodied spectatorship proves that the musical is queer, both from within and without. Ellis writes, the genre's participatory pleasures can offer an important visceral experience of embodying alternatives to one's own life circumstances. In other words, the musical number's temporal difference enables the spectators to imagine different ways of being in the world. Scholar Jill Dolan would consider musical numbers as utopian performatives. She defines them as performances that elevate audiences slightly above the present, offering glimpses of a more emotionally rich and aesthetically powerful world. As such, musical numbers inspire hope by suggesting what life could be like if every experience was equally intense and meaningful. When the characters randomly burst into a musical number, and by having us embody the queer temporality, musicals give us a taste of utopia, or as queer theorist José Esteban Muñoz calls it, a moment of contact that permits us to imagine and potentially make a queer world. And we are not only shown that alternatives to the status quo can exist, but also allowed to viscerally experience these alternatives. In its very semantics, the musical genre is then inherently utopianistic. But utopian thought is not foolproof and is subject to criticism. In Cruel Optimism, Lauren Berlant writes, the very vitalizing or animating potency of an object or scene of desire contributes to the attrition of the very thriving that is supposed to be made possible in the work of the attachment in the first place. Okay, big words, I know, but I'll put it simply. Imagining a better world is not changing the world. The optimism that musicals create is cruel for people that have no control over their living conditions, because their relationship to this fantasy is the only thing that protects them from these systemic imperfections. Utopias are considered then naive and counterproductive. But if hope is not fueled by means of escapism or imagination, what we are left with is the tragic fatality of the bury your gaze trope. The bury your gaze trope is a literary cliché that typically includes a queer love story tragically ending with one or both of the lovers dying. This allowed queer authors to write about queer experiences without openly endorsing homosexuality. With time, this trope evolved into a pessimistic representation that exploits queer trauma in general and wrongly associates it with an unescapable negative outcome and unhappiness. The irony, however, is that we're left with a double-edged sword. We can't be too optimistic about a utopian future because it is considered inefficient, escapist, and borderline reactionary, and we shouldn't either perpetuate negative attitudes towards the queer experience, which are equally counterproductive. So what do we do now? Where do we go from here? In Demanding the Impossible, Tom Moylan presents the concept of critical utopias. He writes, a central concern in the critical utopia is the awareness of the limitations of the utopian tradition, so that these texts reject utopia as a blueprint while preserving it as a dream. Critical utopias, then, are not a goal to achieve, a mission to complete, or a place to escape to, but a lens through which we can critique our reality in comparison. Within the critical utopia, we should locate all these pressing issues from our reality and evaluate the way they're treated in the utopic sphere. For instance, we can find even the most heinous cases of oppression and abuse in critical utopias, but they're treated as insignificant and are thus harmless. Now, it's easy to critique them for trivializing issues that are real and that affect thousands, if not millions, of people. But on the utopic stage, ridiculing important critical issues is in fact a testament to how significant they actually are. Although critical utopias are images from the future, they remain haunted by the present's flaws. They are then a middle ground between futile escapism and tragic fatalism, and so by diminishing the importance of these concerns in the imagined future, we sense a pressing urgency to resolve them in the present. Thus, instead of the utopic longing for a better future then and there, we begin to critically envision our own enhanced version of the present, here and now. Jacques Demy's musicals are a great example of critical utopia, because though his films often deal with tragic content, the musical treatment allows for a potentially joyous experience of it. And by alleviating these tragedies, Demy creates a sense of irony that makes the whole thing, camp. In her seminal essay Notes on Camp, Susan Sontag defines camp as a sensibility that sees things in terms of, quote, style over content, aesthetics over morality, and irony over tragedy. It is undeniable that a musical number is a filmic instance of pure style, in which our attention is directed towards the performance and the theatricality. And so, when the seriousness of the tragedy is dealt with the artificial flamboyance and stylistic excess of the musical numbers, the tragedy is camped. Les Parapluies de Cherbourg is set during the Algerian War. The city of Rochefort is threatened by an axe murderer, and Podan's father basically wants to sleep with her. But the tragedy does not really stand out because of its embellishment by luscious colors, luminous costumes, and the singing and dancing. I mean, look at this dress. It has a cloud in it. This famous scene from Parapluie deals with one of the tragic queer clichés, the ache of desire and forbidden love. When Guy announced that he got drafted in the war, Geneviève sings,
Mais je ne pourrai jamais vivre sans toi. Je ne pourrai pas, ne pars pas, j'en mourrai.
Preferring death over separation is quite a heavy sentiment, but the treatment of it is so unserious and almost awkward. Michel Legrand's music builds up into a melodramatic crescendo, but we don't really see the melodrama embodied in the performance. There are no sobs or heavy waterworks. All we see is barely frowning faces and a few fake tears accumulated under Catherine Deneuve's eye. It's as if Demy's direction was, don't be sad, just act like you are. In other words, she's not crying, but crying. And so the tragedy becomes tragic. Sontag writes, Camp sees everything in quotation marks. And in the very next shot, as Guy is walking Geneviève home, we clearly see that they are not really walking, but standing still, and are being rolled down the street, walking. The tragedy is then made 10 times more ironic by the very fact that they're singing about it, instead of, talking it out like adults and come up with a reasonable way to deal with a breakup. With the queer temporality of the musical numbers, we are focused on the here and the now, and we care infinitely less about what is said than about how it is said. This reduces the weight of the sadness and turns our attention towards theatricality. The viewer is not witnessing a representation of natural life, but a highly stylized one. Another tragic motif of the queer experience is found in Podan, the isolation of the princess and her ostracism from the village for being different. In this scene, the princess is ordered from the royal court to bake a cake for the prince. Again, we are faced with a narratively crucial point that will save her from isolation, but it is treated with the irony and playfulness of camp, making the seriousness fail. First, Podan watches her double walk into the shack to bake the cake herself. As an audience, we accept the absurdity and just play along, as we watch Podan calling out the recipe to her alter ego from the other side of the room.
Préparez votre pâte dans une jatte plate.
An excessive stylistic choice that embellishes the process of baking. She's almost like a kid playing by herself in her room, imagining all sorts of attractions as she creatively prepares the dough. Another thing is la robe couleur de soleil. All this lace could not possibly be practical for baking. In fact, as she's mixing, her big sleeves go into the dough. And the gown's volume puts her at risk of catching flame from the fireplace in the tiny kitchen. But again, style and excess govern the scene, making Podan's suffering a bit less tragic. Demy famously expressed, un film léger parlant de choses graves vaut mieux qu'un film grave parlant de choses légères. In the légèreté of the utopia, Demy playfully resolves some major queer issues. Through a camp sensibility, the seriousness of the tragedies fails, and the audience is empowered, as we find ourselves smiling, or one may say smirking, back at the tragedies. Frederick Finch Frank writes, thanks to Demy's way of seeing, we can approach socially imposed pain with distance, impassivity, or even dance. Demy's films are never tragic for the sake of tragedy, and they're clearly not all rainbows and sunshine and unicorns. They're not escaping and ignoring the imperfections, and they're not a total surrender to oppression either, but a sort of consolation, in which he tells us everything is not okay, and a lot needs to change, but until then, let me sing you a little song.